Welcome back to Q&A, but today's episode is your biggest strength training problems special. We thought this would be a cute little one to do. Now, the first one up we've got is, my back hurts, I'm terrible at making time for lifting mobility, and I'm stuck in a rut. So this isn't really a problem with your programming or knowing what to do. Now, it is somewhat of a knowledge problem, of course. You need some specifics. There's definitely better techniques you could do. There's better programming you can do. But this, to me, sounds like a psychological problem. Now, you might say, why isn't the guy with the sports psych degree not answering this question? I'll say is because sometimes I'm a little bit more direct. Darren's a little bit nicer. He likes to use his Jedi mind techniques to convince you that you're not the problem. But I'm here to tell you that this is your problem. And I mean this in the nicest way possible. When we answer questions, I want you to understand that when we tell you the answers, we want the best for you. That's the whole reason we put out 7 videos pretty much every week. We do these Q&As because I want the best for you. And the problem here is you're the problem. You answered your own question with this question. You're terrible at making time for lifting and mobility. Now, mobility by itself might not solve your back problems. Lifting by itself might not solve your back problems. But there's a good chance if you go about this in the right way, you can solve these problems. It sounds like you already know what the issue is. And your issue here is not making time. You say you're stuck in a rut. So even the phrase you hear, you didn't say, I don't have time. You said, I'm terrible at making time. So the answer here is go make time. You definitely have time. Everyone has time to do this, unless you have an absolute squad of kids at home. You're a single parent. You're working 2 jobs. There's probably a good chance you have time. And even in that case, there's definitely one of those people who still makes time for training. I talked about this a lot last year. I had priorities when I was trying to squat 300 kilos. I had kids, relationships to maintain, business to run, and all of those took priority over squatting in the evening. And I made time at the night, usually around 9:30, 9 p.m. is when I started my squatting sessions, which would take about 45 minutes. Not ideal, but you still make time. And then I'd make time to do mobility before or after that. And it's just about actually realizing that you can go make time. You can go do this for yourself. And this is probably a lot of things that will cover a lot of questions for people, is sometimes you just need to realize you need to go do the things you need to do. But certainly in this case, normally we don't answer injury questions, but this sounds like a injury to the mind question, and you just need to go and make time, I think, is the key here.
Eating in a calorie surplus, but not knowing what to eat, so I end up eating junk food.
Now, another psychic question.
This is a question we actually get anytime we ask for strength-related questions. This idea of gaining weight and eating in a calorie surplus while not letting the wheels fall off completely is really common. And for most people, the idea of eating in a calorie surplus is the dream boat, right? You essentially get to eat whatever you want. You get to eat loads of food. You get to go up in weight without worrying about it too much. But there are certain things you have to take into account. And it's not just a thing of having a tub of ice cream before bed every night. Maybe if you're a 16 or 17-year-old athlete and you really need to gain weight, that will work. But for most of us, a slightly more thought out approach is a lot better. Before I start answering any more, the great resource for this would be someone like Stan Efferding. He has the book, The Vertical Diet, I think is the name of the book, or else that's the name of the diet he agrees with in the book. But he allows for this idea of hyper digestible food. So when we're in a calorie surplus, we'll tend to eat hyper-palatable food. These are sweet foods, high in fat, high in carbohydrates. They're really easy to eat. Our body will actually allow us to eat a lot of them. Generally speaking, if we have a 50-50 split between fat and carbs, it becomes more palatable. But that doesn't often help us digest that food more easily. So if I'm trying to get 4,000 calories per day, in certain cases, that will be doubling the total calorie intake, and you can certainly do it with those hyper-palatable foods, but your digestive system and then your athletic performance will tend to be slightly taken aback by that. Now, the first thing I would go to here is by just working out the rough macros for what you need to hit. Now, when I say rough macros, you want to be really sure you're hitting your protein goals. And I would actually say you're overreaching on those protein goals. The worst thing that's going to happen is some gluconeogenesis and you'll convert some of those proteins into some energy. I wouldn't be massively worried about that. Certainly 2 grams per kilo of body weight will work really well here. Taking a step forward from that then, the other rough macros you obviously need are your carbs and your fat. What I would say is figure out the amount of carbs you need to fuel your training sessions and then work out roughly what the calories are going to be after that. What I mean by carbs fueling sessions is the amount of carbs you're going to have before and after, possibly even during training, that will allow you to feel the most powerful, the most strong, the best recovered you can possibly feel during a training session. For most people, around 50 grams of carbs is going to be the top end of how many carbs you're going to eat during sessions. So if you're in the gym lifting weights, you're obviously not out on a running track and you don't have that mass moving around in your stomach. But generally speaking, 50 grams of carbs, usually in liquid form, usually in highly digestible, fast carbs that you're going to get in quickly, will be the easiest thing to do. The last thing I talk about when we talk about eating in a calorie surplus doesn't mean that you should have massive variance in your diet. When we're losing weight and we're eating in a deficit, we tend to really cut out variance. We tend to keep everything as consistent as possible, have a handful of meals we'll go to. This will make tracking our calories more easily. But when we're eating in a surplus, we really don't want that massive variance either. So for the reasons of sporting performance, for the reasons of easy digestibility, for the reasons of tracking and making sure you're in a surplus and also making sure you're not in too much of a surplus, you should have about 5 to 10 go-to meals that you eat throughout the week, and then you just rinse and repeat with those meals. Don't constantly just go to the shop and get the packet of biscuits you know is going to bump up your calories for the rest of the day. Don't start suddenly adding in loads of scoops of peanut butter into a protein shake that you usually wouldn't do that with. I would just say keep things nice and consistent, work with what you know your protein goals should be, then work out what amount of carbs are good, and then you can fill in the rest with fats.
Recovering with kids plus busy jobs. So this is actually a really common answer, a really common question that we've seen throughout this whole series of questions when we asked about your strength training problems. So there's a couple of things we need to look at here. We need to look at your training stimulus, how much training are you doing, what recovery capital is available to you, and then what becomes negotiable. So when it comes to training stimulus, this is probably the first place I'd look to. What we need to be doing here is thinking quality over quantity. Gone are the days when you're in college and you could spend 3 hours in the gym going to every single machine and just doing as many reps as possible, go home, sit down for 6 hours, probably forget that you're supposed to be studying, eat a lot of food, and then recover pretty well by the next day and go hit a good session. When you have a busy job and kids, you need to be looking at the most precise amount of work that you can get done that still lets you progress and also recover. So we need to be really diligent with what is going on here. If you look at a lot of our programs, most of them are 4 sessions per week. Now, lots of people, for example, if you use the app, will run 2 programs at one time, and this then is something that they're able to judge by themselves. But we make the default assumption that 4 quality sessions across most domains, whether you're a hybrid athlete, a weightlifter, a strength training athlete, someone trying to become a horse, for example, 4 good quality sessions, possibly with some extra conditioning in there, is most feasible for people with a life, with a job, with relationships, especially with kids. So we need to look at training first and really narrow down. I don't know what you're doing in training right now, but we need to narrow down what is going on. Are your training goals realistic? Is the training volume you're doing realistic to support that? And is your recovery realistic to support that amount of training? And as a result, then, are your goals something that is actually achievable for you at this point in your life? So training needs to be ticked off first. We need to say, okay, this is possible, but am I beat up every time I'm training? Am I never hitting the sets and reps I should be able to make or I used to be able to make before these outside nuisances were impacting your training? If that's the case, then we need to reevaluate just how much training we're doing. Next, we need to look at what's actually impacting recovery. And to a large extent, we're going to be looking at sleep, nutrition, and then maybe to a lesser extent, mobility, soft tissue work, which are valuable but aren't going to move the needle massively if your sleep and nutrition are very poor. If you have kids or kids, young or slightly older, depending on what's impacting you, sleep may or may not be an issue for you. Some people have children who sleep really well, and if you go to bed on time, you're perfect. However, what a lot of parents do is they stay up a little bit later for some me time. Me time is over. You don't need me time. Well, you do, but you can't have it. You need to get better sleep. The best me time you can get is not 2 hours awake playing Fortnite or scrolling through your phone for 2 hours or doom scrolling. You need to go to bed. Get extra sleep. This is the best me time. This is the best quality for your mind and your body that you can do. It's something a lot of parents do. We're really taking away our debt from tomorrow, or we're giving off today's debt for tomorrow, thinking we'll feel a little bit better. But we're going to work, we've jobs, we're training, and instead of running off 8.5 hours sleep, we're running off 6 hours sleep. Parents are busy, I understand, I'm also a parent, but you're not that busy that you need to stay up super late. Just go to bed. That's one of the biggest things you need to do. And if your child wakes up multiple times during the night, guess what's better for your sleep? going to bed earlier. You don't have to have a personal life. You have to make some sacrifices with children, at least for certain stages of their development. It's for them. And you being healthier and getting more sleep is going to be better for the child. So going to sleep is a big thing here. Now, nutrition is interesting. The takes on nutrition are complicated, multi-diverse, and depending on what angle you're coming from, this could be wildly different in terms of diets. But as cliche as it sounds, whole foods, things that are less ultra processed, are likely the better way to go. Now, whether that's from a vegan angle or a carnivore angle or a paleo or a Jurassic angle or a horse angle or a vertical angle, whatever angle you come at this from, generally looking at the composition of your foods, you'll know if you're being an asshole. So if we can cover our training load, find if it's appropriate, are we getting enough sleep, and then nutrition, probably the least important of those three, but rather what I would say, it's slightly more important to take care of training and sleep first, and then nutrition will support those really well in the long run. But in the acute training block, the nutrition isn't going to have the biggest impact if training volume and sleep are wrong. Then lastly, soft tissue work, mobility, very useful. If you're getting all the others done really well, then this will really aid in your recovery. And lastly, final closing thought I would say is just accept that you have other responsibilities. You can definitely still progress. You can definitely still get better at your strength training. But unless you're a professional athlete that makes money from your training, it is important to reframe these goals in order of importance for your life at this current stage. Maybe in the future they can take a bit more preference. Maybe you can take a bit of time somewhere else. But right now, it's hard to justify spending a lot of time training unless you have a good reason for it and if you can make it work. So it's important to frame this with yourself and understand that you are, living in service for someone who is more important than you. You are a distant second to your kids now. Their life is in your hands, and it's on you then to make the most time for them. So you being cranky from lack of sleep and distracted because your training isn't going so well, which I'm not saying you are, but it's clearly something that's playing in your mind. So do pay attention just to how important are these to you right now and how are they framed in your mind. You'll also find that you'll have better quality sessions if you reframe them better. If you come into a session knowing you're going to train as hard as possible, but at the end of the day, you're not 21 years old in college, you're possibly in your 30s, you have multiple kids and people who are looking for you to support them. And it's important to come at this knowing that you're doing your best and enjoy your training as much as anything.
Keeping wrists straight in the squat feels good, but harder. And as the reps progress, I lose position. This is super common, by the way. Last weekend when we had the squat seminar, this is a major coaching cue we're giving to people. The idea of having an actual rack position on their back with the barbell rather than the barbell kind of sitting there and their hands just holding onto it. This position demands more of you. So positionally, it's more difficult. This range of motion is more difficult than this, the kind of open hands or the wider hands. It also demands a level of muscular contraction that isn't demanded when there's less tension in the upper body. But the trade-offs are clear. So it might cost us a little bit more. We might have to work a little bit harder to maintain that position. But everything in our squat improves because of it. So what we're doing with our lower body will improve. The ability to keep our upper back tight in a nicely slight extended position will be improved because of it. The barbell tracking will be improved because of it. So then we need to look at what can we do to maybe alleviate some of that loss of position or alleviate some of the fatigue that comes along with it. The first thing is that idea of position. Many of us will slightly lack external rotation of the shoulder, particularly people who might have chased a big bench press or strict press at a time, or anybody who's been involved in grappling or contact sports. Our shoulders will want to sit a bit further forward like this, particularly if you then work at a desk, it won't be helped by that. And so the first thing we need to look at is external rotation of the shoulder. Not only am I fighting the position, not only am I working to contract those muscles hard, but if I'm tight through that range of motion, I'll have to work against myself and then work against the weight. So external rotation of the shoulder, making sure I can abduct my shoulders well, is a huge part of it. Moving on from that then, what we're really looking to do is maintain good squat positions so my upper back and arms don't have to work overtime just to hold on to that rack position. What I'm talking about here is the tracking of the hips and in particular how those hips interact with our torso. most of the time we'll see people losing that upper back position is as they drive out of the bottom of the squat, their hips will shoot back, their torso will slightly incline forward, and because of that, then they start pushing their elbows up like this to almost fight against the barbell. If my squat positioning is good and my squat technique is good, if I maintain that consistent torso angle throughout the entire squat, the upper back is in a far better position to maintain its own positions. So we're making it easier to maintain positions by having better squat mechanics. The final thing then is an idea of local muscular endurance. So if I ask you to pick up a kettlebell and it's a 32 kilo kettlebell and I ask you to do curls with it and you've never done curls before, it's going to be too difficult. If I even ask you to pick up a 12 kilo kettlebell and do some curls or some presses with it, after 10, 15, 20 reps, you'll start to become fatigued. And particularly due to the fact that in your question you say it gets worse as the reps go on, what we're seeing here is as we get later in the reps, there's less of that local muscular endurance, so it's harder for me to maintain the position. What's actually happening is just the amount of energy stored within that muscle is decreasing. So it's not necessarily that all of that glycogen is being used up. It's not necessarily that I'm completely depleting my muscle stores of energy, but I'll find it more difficult to maintain that level of contraction I need. And this, of course, is compounded by the second thing I mentioned, is as the squat reps go on, I'm probably losing position slightly, and so I'm having to work even harder against it. So I get this compounding variable of my positions are worse, so my upper back has to work harder, and then I'm not used to that straight wrist and stacked upper back position, and so I'm losing that level of muscular capacity, or I don't have that amount of muscular capacity to use. What I would recommend massively here is look at the mobility of the shoulders, make sure I can maintain that position. On a quick brief side note here, this position shouldn't be that easy to maintain. If you're stacking in this position and it's super loose and you feel like you could stay there all day, you're probably not generating enough tension. We often talk about the front rack position before a jerk should be as if someone's screaming at you in your brain. You don't want it to be that level of severity. You don't want that level of kind of isometric hold there, but you should be holding onto the bar quite hard. It should be a difficult position to maintain. Then once I've made sure my mobility, I have the requisite mobility to maintain that position, I can start slowly scooting my hands into a more parallel forearm position. And once I've done that, once I know I can hit the position, it's just a thing of running that for multiple squat cycles in a row. Maybe after 20 sessions of squatting, you'll probably feel far, far better.
The next question is accumulative fatigue. So this used to be known as creeping fatigue back in the day, and the idea behind this is that this is the total fatigue that builds up on training over the course of a particularly extended period of time. So training fatigue isn't always dissipated just after a session. So if we do a squat session on Monday, there's no guarantee that all that fatigue is gone by Wednesday. And after a period of time, this starts to build up a little bit. If you think about this, you're on a stairway and there's a magic shithead adding a step every time you train. So every time you go training, you're walking up those steps in between training sessions, and then you hit a hard training session, there's more steps added above you. Your recovery rate is how fast you walk up these steps. And if you train on Monday, you give yourself Tuesday and Wednesday to recover, you reach the top of that next step. But you also get a little bit faster or a little bit better at walking up those steps. However, if we start in a position where we train Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, we're never really getting to a good place on those steps, and someone's adding more all the time. And eventually we get to this place after weeks or months where the stairs are so far ahead of us, just to get back to the ground floor, we're super fatigued. This is really common in people who don't have good programming, who don't apply a programming structure to themselves. This is common in athletes who are training a lot, who have very brief time between off seasons or in seasons where they're big long in season, they move to another sport. This is common in teenagers who play multi-sports. There's even kind of a phenomenon known as in recent years that multi-sport teenager getting injured. We have this in, for example, the female athlete triad syndrome, where they essentially train so hard, under-consume calories so consistently that we end up with a huge amount of cumulative fatigue. And eventually we're going to get to a place where we'll end up with something known as overtraining. Overtraining is very real. Don't believe any Instagram influencer who's just doing a bit of physique work, who's just training for general health. Overtraining is undoubtedly real. It's very real in the literature. There's a load of clinical symptoms such as erratic resting heart rate, really high resting heart rate, really low resting heart rate, upset GI tract, very poor sleep, wake you up in the middle of the night wide awake, anxiety, feelings of depression, really hot temperature, really low body temperature, variety of different symptoms present, muscle aches, joint pains. And the interesting thing about overtraining is there's no real fast way to get out of an overtraining place. When your overtraining syndrome is present, you have to wait it out. A lot of them probably looking at somewhere between 2 to maybe 6 months, depending on how severe the overtraining is. And if we have a huge amount of fatigue acclimatized to ourselves, or we have a huge amount of fatigue built up, it's going to take a very long time for that to return to that baseline. You've put yourself so far into the hole that there's just no way you can get out of there in a fast fashion, and you need to give your body time and grace to get out of that place. So when it comes to accumulative fatigue, I'd say the most important thing you need to be looking for is structured training. Athletes who have structured training with inability to listen to themselves, but programming that makes sense, will then allow those recoveries to happen. We made a reel recently on Instagram talking about how the deload every 4 weeks doesn't need to happen. Some people are making it a prescriptive thing, which can be fine. Our view is you're just wasting a lot of time. You're not going to get a lot of good momentum going. However, that doesn't mean you don't take deloads. Deloads come at particular intervals. And the big thing with good training is that there's these wave-like structure, or at least that's how we will approach training in those longer periods where we're training for maybe 16 weeks in a row. There will be times in that training where all of your volume regresses or all of your intensity regresses, and we allow different stimulus to be present, or we reduce the total stimulus, so then you can move forward in a recovered state but still get productive training in without necessarily taking a deload week. So the big thing here is, unless you have an underlying symptom, you've disease state, or you're under feeding yourself calories chronically, which can happen where people are consistently in a caloric deficit, they want to maintain a leanness year round. Unless those are the causes, the main thing I'd be looking at here is your actual training structure. And the good thing about a good training structure is this will allow you to recover during certain periods. It's a form of classic periodization. Whatever form of periodization you're looking at, there is that third phase, and that is essentially the phase where you get time to rest. Even if you're an elite athlete, and especially if you're a non-professional athlete, you need time to rest. So there needs to be periods of the year where you're just taking a little bit easy, and that just 1 week won't always cover it. Sometimes we need a couple of weeks to let this dissipate and really coast along.
Knowing when to shift from pure strength focus to power and speed for sport. The great thing is, in most sports, you won't know when to shift because you will just be made shift. So let's take, for example, a rugby player. As you're going from off season, you transition through preseason and into your season of games, you are going to have to shift to speed and power work then. That's just how it works. That's generally how block periodization will work for field sports athletes. This tends to be true for almost all sports. What I mean by this is, when you're off season, you're probably working on that strength. You're probably working through a lot of training volume to bring that strength up. And then when you're in season, when you're doing your sport specific work, you should be really working on power and what you're calling here speed for sport, or sport specific speed work. There is a bit of a caveat to this. When you're in season, you need to do a certain level of strength maintenance. There's a case to be made where, depending on the exercise selection and the loading pattern of your power work, you will actually get sufficient strength maintenance work in there. But it should be said that you have to be trying to, and I'm putting trying to in almost inverted commas here, you have to be trying to hold on to those strength numbers when you're in season. If you're in a slightly different sport, where maybe you don't have very well defined seasons, maybe you can compete once, twice, or 3 times per year, you have to be the moderator of that. You have to be the person who moves you down along that force velocity curve and push you towards that more power training and specific speed work for your sport. What I would say in that case, if you're going to run through, let's say, 4-month blocks, you should be spending about half your time in the strength training phase and about half your time in the power and speed training phase. So if you're a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athlete, you know you want to go to Euros next year. Let's say Euros is on in February. You should be doing January and February as your power and specific speed work for your sport. And then December and November would have been your big strength training block. There are definitely cases to be made where certain sports will need slightly less strength work and slightly more speed and power work. In those cases, you're looking at the very specific end of sports S&C. You're really looking at the 60-meter indoor sprint. You're looking at the 100-meter sprint. You're looking at some of the very specific jumping disciplines in track and field. But I'm not really putting them into the field sports or racket sports or ball sports arena. Generally speaking, for most sports where athleticism is prized, about 50% of your time, and that's your off season, is going to be strength training. About 50% of your time is speed and power training. The final thing I would say on this is that most people have too little time for strength training, and their seasons tend to be prolonged, so they spend too much time in the speed and power end of things. Speed and power training for most people at most times in their career is simply a translation exercise. You are bringing all of those gains you've made from the high volume work, the strength work, some hypertrophy work. You've hopefully gained some lean tissue mass. You've certainly gained capacity for maximum voluntary contraction within those muscles. And now when I go into my speed and power training phase, all I'm doing is simply translating all of this increased physiological capacity, and I'm bringing it over and teaching it how to move fast and contract as quickly as possible. This is almost entirely a skill, and it's slightly a physiological thing I'm doing with training. Over here, it's almost entirely a physiological change and only very slightly a skill increase or a learning of new skills. If you're in the case where most of your season, let's say 9 months of the year, is going to be spent playing your sport, you are going to have to give yourself a certain period of that in season or specific training time to actually say, look, I know I mightn't be getting the best performance on the field now, but it is September and my most important games are going to be in April. So let's say for September and October, I actually prolong that strength training block, and it brings me into the start of the season. And then when I get into the more business end of the season, I'm really hitting those higher power output numbers. The problem is, if you're in the mandated strength and conditioning world, or you have somebody coaching you, they're not going to want that. They'll basically want to hand you over to your sports coaches in the best shape possible. And so a lot of the time, they'll actually transition you out of strength training slightly too early. You'll decay too much in season, and then next year you're starting at point blank zero again, rather than starting with 5% or 10% extra and kind of building year on year.
Struggling to program cardio alongside maintaining strength. So this is something that is a really good idea to do for general health and for your strength training. The cardiovascular work, aerobic work is really valuable for your strength training and your life. The biggest issue I see people running into here when they're used to doing strength training and have a very low aerobic base, or have zero, or haven't done it in a very long time, is they underestimate just how long and slow you need to introduce and taper in the cardiovascular work into your training. A lot of times people will go too hard into it. They'll go into a form of cardio that is just too intense. People often default to running, which is without a doubt the worst one that you can add into. Now, unless you really want to do running, which is fine, then you're making us understanding that temporarily your strength training is going to take a hit. And when we're talking about temporarily, we're probably talking about 6 months or more. But if you're trying to add in cardio with the least impact on your strength training, I would highly recommend a stationary piece of equipment. Generally, a stationary bike is one of the best ones. Some people like rowing. So rowing takes a lot of technique, takes a long time to row efficiently, can be uncomfortable on your lower back depending on your mobility. It is a good form. Ski erg might be fine. You just need to look for something that has the lowest impact on you. And in most cases, a stationary bike is probably one of the best ones we have here. What you need to think about here is going low and slow for a very long time. I want you to think about introducing this in 6-month blocks. We're talking 10, 15-minute bouts for the initial few weeks. You need to just get really used to this. If you're very out of shape, conditioning-wise, aerobically, 10 or 15 minutes is probably going to fatigue you a little bit. It's going to feel like a long time if you're not used to doing that. So I would recommend just really slow. Start with 2 bouts per week, and then increase the length of these bouts as they feel comfortable over the course of about 6 months. Go really slow. There's no rush with it. You're getting benefits on your strength training and your health as you add this in, and you usually want to get to an area of about 30 minutes. Now, you can do this on a separate day from your strength training, or you can do this after your strength training or in the morning of, depending on what is the most feasible for you in your life and your strength training goals and how you're structuring that. I would add it in until you get to about 30-minute bouts, and then you can decide, do you want to do more frequency, Do you want to increase the intensity of these 30-minute bouts? You can look at wattage, you can look at calories burned, you can look at a certain heart rate that you want to maintain for a period of time and taper this in or increase the intensity of these. I personally like to look at calories general. I will look at my heart rate and maintain it there, but what I like to do for a longer bout sessions, 2 times a week, I'll do about an hour stationary bike, and I look to increase the calories where if it's feasible. You want to look to get to a place where 1,000 calories per hour is a pretty good place. Now, this is probably more than you really need to do for strength training, but it's just something I want to do for myself in particular. But just to give you a general idea that you need to taper this up over the course of months and eventually years. You don't need to rush it anywhere, just slowly increase it. You want to bring in this new stimulus in such a fashion that your strength training isn't going to take a massive hit. There's no reason you need to immediately barge it in. You could do that. You could front load it. You could go into a place where you spend the first 6 months really focusing on your conditioning and you let your strength training take a hit, but then you're in a place where you need to maintain your conditioning and then try and increase your strength training back to where you were. I think a better plan for most people whose strength training is their first goal is slowly taper in the conditioning work or the cardio work and then let it kind of acclimatize, and after a year or two you'll find yourself well adapted.
I'm struggling in heavy AM sessions after training throughout the week at PM. What's probably happening here is 2 things. When we train in the evening, we're generally a bit more prepared. And I'm talking about physiologically and psychologically prepared to lift weights or run fast or do explosive things or play sport or whatever. Particularly for strength training, when we get out of bed immediately, the first few hours in the morning, we're really not primed to produce as many neurotransmitters as possible, to send as many signals down our spinal cord as we possibly can. That's the physiological side of things. My amount of blood flow isn't quite the same. My blood pressure isn't quite the same. My body just isn't that prepared in the morning to go and lift heavy weights. The second thing is, when we're in the evening or when we're training in the evening, psychologically we're in a slightly different headspace. Usually we've done a full day's work or a full day's study in school or in university or whatever. And when we go and train, this is now a very, very positive psychological point, right? I finished my day's work. I can now put all of that out of my head and go and train. The problem in this case, so like general recommendations is this case is you do your standard sessions during the week, and then you might do some accessory work, some mobility work, some bodybuilding, some hypertrophy when you're training on a Saturday or Sunday morning or something along those lines. The problem in this case is when I do that, or when I choose to do that, if the Saturday morning session is important, or say I play a game on Sunday mornings, I can't be showing up half cooked on a Saturday or Sunday morning when this might be the most important session of the week. So in many gyms, it's super common to train Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then you have a big session on Saturday morning and everyone's there at the gym, and max outs tend to happen on those mornings. So we now need to look at how can we make some sort of adaptation or bring in some sort of habit routine that brings my psychology and my physiology online with what it would be like at 7 p.m. on Monday, Wednesday and Friday evenings. In terms of the physiology thing, what you probably need to do is just do a small bit more physical work before you start those heavier or faster sets. What I mean by this is you probably need to hop on the bike for a bit longer. You might need to do a bit more of a general movement warm-up just to start increasing that amount of mind-muscle connection, to make sure your brain is turned on a small bit more. If you think about it, as you go throughout the day, you're making thousands of decisions. Your body is incredibly adept at tuning into those decisions. The first time you ever walk into a room, you have to look for the light switch. I guarantee you, once you live in a house for 10 years, you just throw your hand out and turn the light on without even checking what switch you're hitting. So Saturday mornings, we arrive at the gym, we hop on an exercise bike, rowing machine, ski erg, anything along those lines. You do 10 or 15 minutes of that cardiovascular baseline warm-up. What we probably need to add in now at this point is some general movement warm-up. So during the week, you might get away with going immediately from the erg equipment over onto a barbell and start doing snatches plus hang snatch complexes to warm up, or doing some general barbell warm-ups. What I would recommend in this case, just to start getting yourself a small but more physiologically primed, is doing some sort of skill acquisition piece. This might be spending 5 minutes throwing a ball against a wall left hand, right hand, over and back. Ideally, if you have a training partner, you could do this, or you could even get a reaction ball. They look like rubber tennis balls with kind of weird bumps and growths on them. This sort of stuff will start getting you much more primed, start really cutting those reaction times down. And even if it's something as simple as a barbell back squat or a deadlift, which is incredibly simple in terms of the overall movement pattern itself, you're going to be a lot more primed to do it once you've done some of the higher skill pieces beforehand. The second thing then is the psychological element, making sure you're psychologically ready to lift heavy weights or run fast times or whatever it is. In my opinion, the best way of doing this is trying to homogenize the psychological state we have in the evenings with the psychological state we have in the mornings or the AM sessions you're going to do at the weekend. How I like people to go about this is just by getting into a certain mind frame, so a framing exercise pre-PM sessions and pre-AM sessions. What this generally looks like is around 3 to 5 minutes with a post-it note or notes app on your phone. I want you to write out the 3 aims for the session, or it can be 3 things you're grateful for about being able to go and train, or it might be 3 coaching cues your coach gave you last week. In this case, the important element of a framing intervention is that you're going to sit there for the 3 minutes and ruminate over these facts. How I like to start off doing it is a lot of the time I'll be thinking about things I'm grateful for training. So this training session is going to make me stronger. Maybe I'm getting to attempt a heavier weight than I've attempted before. Maybe I felt really good last week when I played a game, and so this session is going to make me even better. When I start that framing intervention and I have those things written out, the first thing I do is just constantly read through those things. I'll read those sentences probably 4 or 5 times each. The second thing I do for the framing is once I've read them 3 or 4 times each, I'm then going to elaborate on each thing. I feel much stronger after these training sessions because X, Y, and Z. I love getting to go and train on a Saturday morning or a Tuesday evening because X, Y, and Z. And then once I've done that, usually my 3 or 5 minute timer has already gone off on my phone and I am set within a certain frame of mind for the actual training session itself. Framing just gets us to shift the perspective with which we view the training session. The real golden aspect of this is that if I'm used to doing a framing intervention before my PM sessions, and now I start doing a framing session before my AM sessions as well, I can basically bring that same mind frame, or I can bring that same level of perspective or angle of perspective onto the training session that I would have had midweek, and now put it on that AM weekend session, and hopefully I'll be much more psychologically aligned with what I would have been doing in the midweek sessions.
I want to train more, but I'm not able to recover from it. So this is a good idea in theory. So the more training you can do that you can recover from, in theory, the better you can get faster. However, this isn't so simple, and ultimately there's going to be a cap on your ability to recover from certain training. So there's 2 areas we can look at here that will reliably increase your way of recovering from training. Well, there's actually 3, but I'm sure you can guess what the third one is, and there's no need for us to talk about that one. The first one in the short term is your work capacity, your ability just to do a lot of volume of whatever task you're trying to do and then recover from it in between sets, in between exercises, or in between sessions. So this will come in the form of doing GPP phases, shortened work rest periods, having a decent anaerobic and aerobic base, and having a good variety of exercises done per session where you'll eventually be able to do a little bit more. Now, most training sessions or most training blocks in terms of kind of classical periodization will start with this GPP phase if an athlete needs it. This will look like non-specific training. This might look like higher volume work. This might be generic sled pushes and pulls and battle ropes and stuff like that, and assault bike tabetas and all that great stuff, which will definitely build your work capacity. So I'd look here first and see, is your work capacity sufficient? Do you dedicate times throughout the year where you do specific work capacity periods that will allow you then to recover in those sessions, make you a bit more robust? Then you look at a reasonably consistent stream of conditioning or aerobic work that will allow you to be metabolically in a place where you can tolerate a little bit more training load, and as a result should be able to recover a little bit better. The second area you want to look at then is your training age. This is something that the more you train, the longer you train, the more proficient you get at the activity you're trying to doing. Assuming this question or these questions were specific to strength training, the longer you strength train, the better you're able to tolerate loads. The first time you squat 200 kilos versus the 1,000th time you squat 200 kilos, it's going to be a lot more easy on your body. You're going to be more efficient with it. It's going to be psychologically less effort and all around less impactful on your recovery. So the length of time you're training is probably one of the biggest factors that we can alter here, assuming we take care of your work capacity. However, we can't really speed up training age, and this comes down to sensible programming, also while incorporating work capacity extras. So when we're throughout the year, we're including these phases of general physical preparedness for however long that might need to last. Maybe it's 4 weeks, maybe you include it in a specific form that's distinct from your other training where you really go into a GPP phase, or maybe you include a phase that's just very high volume with low rest periods. For example, you're doing sets of 10, multiple sets of 10 on the back squat, or you're doing multiple sets of 10 on the belt squat or something like that, or you're doing every minute on the minute for deadlifts, or whatever you feel would be appropriate for you. Shortening those rest times, increasing the amount of work you do per that minute of work or whatever your exercise you're choosing. And then if you do that for enough years, eventually your ability to recover will improve. However, there's going to be a cap on this genetically. And then if you're looking at other areas of stress, what are the things that take away from you, your job, your work, your relationships, how much you sleep, all of that will come into it. They may or may not be consistent, will probably fluctuate over the course of your life. And that's why elite athletes are trained the way they are.